Hello there, listeners of Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to connect with you wherever you are in this vast world. How has your day been treating you? Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you're part of this community that seeks the mysteries hidden just beneath the surface of our everyday world. Maybe you're a night shift worker in Detroit, listening through earbuds as you patrol empty hallways. Perhaps you're a college student in Sydney, staying up too late when you should be studying. Or you could be someone like me, someone who discovered that reality has layers most people never see, never want to see. If this is your first time here, welcome to the rabbit hole. If you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back to explore these dark corners with us. Either way, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. Your subscription helps us continue exploring these mysteries that powerful people would prefer remain buried. My name is Elias Hart. I'm 37 years old, and I was an investigative writer for the Boston Globe before everything changed. I say was because I'm not sure what I am now, or even if I'm still alive in the way you understand it. I'm not even sure if Elias Hart was ever really my name, or just another identity in a chain of identities stretching back through time. But I need to tell you this story before they find me again, before they make me disappear the way they made Thomas disappear in 1925. Before they erase my memories and reset the cycle one more time. You see, it started with a dream that wasn't a dream. A memory that wasn't mine. Or at least, it shouldn't have been mine. For 3 months, I would wake up every morning at exactly 4:17 a.m., drenched in sweat that smelled like salt water, my heart pounding like I'd been running for my life. But in the dream, I wasn't running. I was standing perfectly still on a weathered wooden dock, salt air burning my lungs like acid, holding a silver pocket watch in my trembling hands. The weight of it felt so real I could still feel the cool metal against my palm when I woke up, could still hear the steady tick, tick, tick that seemed to count down to something terrible. The watch was beautiful and ancient, engraved with intricate scroll work around the edges, and an inscription on the back that I could read as clearly as if I were holding it in my waking hands. To my darling Thomas, may time stand still for us. All my love, SM. The hands were stopped at 11:47, frozen at a moment that felt more significant than any moment in my real life. There was always a woman in the dream. She wore a yellow dress that moved like liquid sunlight in the ocean breeze, and she was walking away from me down that endless dock. The dress was perfectly period appropriate for the 1920s, with a dropped waist and delicate beadwork that caught the light as she moved. Her shoulders shook with sobs I couldn't hear over the crash of waves against the pilings below, but I could feel her anguish like a physical weight in my chest. Every time I tried to call out to her, tried to run after her, my voice would catch in my throat like I was drowning. My legs would feel like they were made of lead, rooted to the weathered planks beneath my feet. I could only watch as she grew smaller and smaller, until she was just a speck of yellow at the far end of the dock, and then nothing at all. The grief I felt watching her leave was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my waking life. It was the kind of devastating loss that carves out your insides and leaves you hollow, the kind that makes you understand why people say heartbreak is a physical pain. It felt like watching every good thing in the world walk away forever, like losing not just one person, but losing yourself, your purpose, your reason for existing. But here's the thing that haunted me most. I had never seen this woman before in my life. I had never owned a silver pocket watch. I had never been to any dock that looked like the one in my dreams. I'd grown up in suburban Chicago, spent my entire adult life in Boston. The closest I'd ever come to a dock was the tourist harbour, where I'd taken a whale watching tour on a first date. It wasn't just a dream, it was a memory, but it wasn't mine. At least it shouldn't have been mine. The dreams became more frequent, more vivid. Soon I was having them every night, sometimes multiple times per night. I would wake up, lie awake for hours trying to shake the feeling of loss, then fall back asleep, only to find myself on that dock again, watching that woman walk away again. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, writing down every detail I could remember before they faded. The dock had 43 planks from the shore to the end. I counted them every time. Some were missing, creating gaps that showed the dark water below. The brass cleats for tying up boats were green with corrosion, and there were exactly 7 of them spaced along the left side. In the distance I could always see a lighthouse with distinctive red trim around its windows, and beyond that, a line of pine trees that seemed to stretch forever. I could describe the woman's yellow dress in obsessive detail, the exact shade that reminded me of early morning sunlight filtering through sheer curtains, the way it buttoned up the back with exactly 17 tiny pearl buttons, the lace collar that was slightly torn on the left side where it had caught on something. Her hair was the colour of dark honey, pinned up in the Gibson girl style popular in the 1920s, but a few strands always escaped to frame her face in the ocean breeze. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, shaped like a crescent moon, a beauty mark on her right cheek. Her eyes were the colour of sea glass, and when she looked back at me over her shoulder before disappearing, they held a sadness so profound it made me want to follow her into whatever darkness waited at the end of that dock. But the most disturbing detail was the blood. There was always blood on the dock planks, dark stains that the salt water couldn't wash away. Not a lot, just a few drops here and there, as if someone had been injured and tried to walk it off. In the dream, I always knew the blood was mine, though I could never see any wounds on my body. The dreams began affecting my waking life. I would catch myself staring out windows, looking for that flash of yellow fabric. I would hear the sound of waves when I was in the middle of the city, blocks from any water. The smell of salt air would hit me on perfectly calm days, so strong it would make my eyes water. My editor at the Globe started noticing my distraction. Articles would be turned in late, interviews would be rescheduled because I'd oversleep after another night of those dreams. My girlfriend Sarah started asking questions I couldn't answer. How do you explain to someone that you're falling in love with a woman from a dream, mourning a loss that never happened to you? The relationship ended on a Tuesday morning when Sarah found my notebook full of sketches and descriptions of the woman in yellow. She thought I was having an affair, and in a way, maybe I was. How do you compete with a ghost from someone else's memory? But the breaking point came 3 weeks later, when I was walking past an antique shop in the North End and saw something in the window that made my blood turn to ice. It was a silver pocket watch, identical to the one from my dreams, same scrollwork around the edges, same size and weight that I somehow knew without touching it. I stood there for 20 minutes, staring at it through the glass, while people walked around me like I was a statue. The shop owner, an elderly man with kind eyes, eventually came outside to see what had caught my attention. "That's a beautiful piece," he said. "1920s Swiss made, founded in an estate sale up in Maine. The inscription is what makes it special." He brought the watch outside and opened it for me to see the back. There in elegant script were the words I had read 100 times in my dreams. "To my darling Thomas, may time stand still for us. All my love, M." I bought the watch without negotiating the price. The moment it was in my hands, I felt a jolt of recognition so strong it made me dizzy. This wasn't just similar to the watch from my dreams. This was the same watch. Somehow, impossibly, I was holding a piece of my dreams in the real world. That night the dream changed. Instead of just watching the woman walk away, I could hear her voice for the first time. "Thomas," she was calling. "Thomas, you have to remember. You have to finish what you started." I woke up with her voice still echoing in my ears and the absolute certainty that my name was not Elias Hart. My name was Thomas Ellery, and I had died in 1925 with unfinished business that was still calling me back from whatever lies beyond death. 3 months after I bought the pocket watch, I was researching a completely different story about government surveillance programs when I stumbled across something that changed everything. I had been investigating a whistleblower's claims about domestic spying operations, following a paper trail through decades of declassified documents, when I found a file that should never have been released to the public. It was buried so deep in the digital archives that I'm convinced I was never supposed to find it. The file was labelled Project Echo, Final Termination Report, classified above top secret. The stamp across the cover read, "Eyes only, authorised personnel only, violation punishable by death." Most of it was heavily redacted, black bars covering entire paragraphs like scars across the pages. But what remained readable was extraordinary, terrifying, and impossible all at once. Project Echo had been a series of experiments conducted between 1978 and 1986, focused on what the documents called spontaneous past life recall incidents and consciousness transfer protocols. The introduction, one of the few sections left largely intact, read like something out of a science fiction novel. Following successful preliminary studies into electromagnetic consciousness manipulation, Project ECHO was initiated to investigate, document and potentially control human reincarnation phenomena. Initial hypothesis: human consciousness operates on quantum frequencies that can be measured, mapped and redirected using appropriate technological intervention. They had identified and studied dozens of individuals who claimed to remember living previous lives with shocking specificity. But these weren't just random cases of people claiming to be Napoleon or Cleopatra. These were ordinary people with extraordinary memories of ordinary lives, people who could provide verifiable details about times and places they had never been. One case file stood out among the rest. Subject 72, a woman named Linda Vasquez from Denver, had been having vivid dreams about being a schoolteacher in rural Kansas in 1912. The dreams had started when she was 34, triggered by a near-death experience during surgery. Under hypnosis, she had provided names, addresses, and intimate details about the daily life of this supposed previous incarnation. She described the one-room schoolhouse where she taught, down to the number of desks and the pattern of scratches on the blackboard. She knew the names of all her students, their family histories, their individual learning challenges. She could recite the curriculum she had taught, remember the contents of letters she'd received from the school board, even describe the boarding house where she had lived, and the exact pattern of wallpaper in her room. The CIA team had sent investigators to verify her claims, expecting to debunk what they assumed were elaborate fantasies. What they found should have been impossible. Every detail Linda Vasquez provided was accurate. The school where she claimed to have taught had existed exactly as she described it. The children she named had attended that school during the 1912 to 1913 academic year. The boarding house had been run by a woman whose name, physical description, and even personality quirks matched exactly what Subject 72 had provided. Property records, census data, even a photograph in the local historical society confirmed her descriptions down to the placement of windows in the classroom and the specific pattern of roses on the wallpaper in her boarding house room. But Linda Vasquez had been born in 1951. The schoolteacher she remembered being, a woman named Catherine Mills, had died in an influenza outbreak in 1913, nearly 40 years before Subject 72 was even born. There was no genetic connection between the families. No way Linda could have known any of this information through conventional means. The documentation was meticulous. The investigators had spent months verifying every detail, cross-referencing Linda's memories with historical records, newspaper archives, and surviving family members of Catherine Mills's students. They had even found Catherine Mill's personal diary in the archives of the Kansas Historical Society, and it matched Linda's recollections perfectly, including private thoughts and experiences that had never been shared with anyone. But the case file contained one more bombshell. Under deep hypnosis, Linda had revealed that Catherine Mills had not died of influenza, as the official records claimed. She had been murdered, poisoned by someone working for what she described as government men investigating strange occurrences in the area. According to Linda's recovered memories, Catherine had discovered a facility hidden in the prairie where experiments were being conducted on people who claimed to remember previous lives. The project had continued for 8 years, documenting case after case of impossible memories. The files contained hundreds of similar cases. A World War II veteran who remembered being a Civil War soldier, complete with knowledge of battle strategies and troop movements that had never been publicly documented. A child in California who spoke fluent Latin and could describe life in ancient Rome with archaeological accuracy. A woman in Maine who remembered every detail of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic from the perspective of a nurse who had died in the outbreak. But as I read deeper into the files, a disturbing pattern emerged. Many of the subjects had died under mysterious circumstances after their memories were verified. car accidents, sudden heart attacks, suicides that made no sense given the subject's mental states. The official reports always concluded these were coincidences, but handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. Subject 45 eliminated after attempting to contact journalists, read one note. Subject 67 relocated to secure facility following security breach, read another. Recommend immediate memory modification for all remaining subjects. Then, suddenly, Project ECHO was terminated. The official reason cited in the documents was national security concerns and resource reallocation to higher priority projects. All surviving subjects were administered what the files euphemistically called memory modification therapy. All research materials were ordered destroyed. But in the margin of one of the final reports, someone had written a note in blue ink. The handwriting was shaky, urgent. Memory is transferable. The past is not gone, only hidden. They're coming back faster now. Pattern suggests guidance. Below that, in different handwriting in red ink, recommend immediate deep cover protocols. Evidence suggests intentional guidance of specific consciousness streams into predetermined genetic lines. Someone or something is controlling the process. And at the bottom of the page, in a third handwriting, was a note that made my blood run cold. Project terminated by direct order of Deputy Director. All personnel reassigned. New phase authorised under different classification. God help us all. I read those lines 15 times before their implications sank in. They weren't just studying reincarnation. They believed someone or something was controlling it, guiding specific souls back into specific circumstances for reasons they couldn't understand. And that discovery had frightened them enough to shut down the entire project. But the most disturbing part was the date on the termination order, March 15th, 1986. Project Echo had been shut down, but that didn't mean the research had stopped. It meant it had gone deeper underground, hidden under new classifications, new project names. I printed every page I could access and started looking for connections to more recent government programs. What I found suggested that Project ECHO hadn't been terminated at all. It had evolved. Armed with the knowledge from Project Echo, I began looking for similar cases that might have been dismissed or covered up in the decades since the project's official termination. What I found was a pattern stretching back to the 1980s and continuing to the present day, hidden in plain sight among medical journals, psychology case studies, and local news stories that had been buried or discredited. My first lead came from Dr. Rebecca Santos, a child psychiatrist in Tucson who had been quietly documenting unusual cases for 20 years. When I called her, she was initially hesitant to talk, but when I mentioned Project Echo, her tone changed immediately. "How do you know about ECHO?" she asked. "That's not something that shows up in declassified files." I told her about my research, and she agreed to meet me at her clinic after hours. Dr. Santos was a small woman in her 50s, with tired eyes and hands that shook slightly when she poured coffee. She had been documenting cases like Marcus Chen's for 2 decades, she told me, and she had been visited by government officials on multiple occasions who had made it clear that publishing her findings would be inadvisable. "They don't threaten you directly," she explained. "They just mention how easy it would be to lose your medical license, how unfortunate it would be if your research funding disappeared, how sad it would be if something happened to your family. Very professional, very polite, very clear." Marcus Chen was 6 years old when his parents brought him to Dr. Santos. His nightmares had started when he turned 5. Vivid dreams of flying in combat that left him screaming about zeros at 2 o'clock and flak bursts at 10,000 feet. His parents, both software engineers with no military background, had no idea where he was getting this information. But Marcus didn't just have nightmares. During the day, he would draw incredibly detailed pictures of World War II aircraft, complete with accurate cockpit layouts, armament configurations, and squadron markings. He would recite radio call signs and aircraft identification numbers that his parents had never heard. He spoke in the clipped professional tone of a military pilot when discussing these aircraft, using technical terminology that even aviation enthusiasts would struggle with. "I used to fly the Lightning," he told Dr. Santos matter-of-factly during their first session. as if he were talking about riding his bicycle. P-38L, tail number 44553254, but the engines would freeze up at altitude over the Pacific. Lost 3 good men to that problem before they figured out the glycol mixture. Dr. Santos had spent hours researching Marcus's claims. The P-38 Lightning had indeed suffered from engine problems in cold weather during Pacific theatre operations. The specific tail number Marcus mentioned had belonged to a real aircraft flown by the 475th Fighter Group, and the glycol mixture he referenced had been a real technical modification implemented in late 1944 to address engine icing problems. But Marcus Chen was 6 years old and lived in the desert southwest. He had never seen a World War II aircraft in person, never visited an aviation museum, never shown any interest in military history until the dream started. When Dr. Santos showed Marcus historical photographs of various aircraft, he identified them instantly. Not just the famous ones like the P-51 Mustang, but obscure variants and prototype models that even aviation experts would struggle to recognise. He knew which airfields they had operated from, what their tactical limitations were, and he could draw detailed diagrams of their cockpit layouts from memory. The worst part, Dr. Santos told me, was when I showed him a picture of a pilot from the 475th Fighter Group. The photograph was from a squadron reunion in 1995, 50 years after the war ended. Marcus looked at it for a long moment, then pointed to one of the elderly men in the front row. "That's Charlie Morrison," Marcus had said. "He was my wingman. We flew together over Luzon." Then he'd started crying, deep, heartbroken sobs that no 6-year-old should be capable of. "He made it home. I'm glad he made it home." Dr. Santos had tracked down the man in the photograph. Charles Morrison, aged 89, living in a retirement home in Phoenix. When she called him and described Marcus's claims, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Tommy?" Charlie Morrison had whispered. "Tommy Kellerman?" But that's impossible. Tommy died over Luzon in February 1945, shot down by Zeros while protecting a bomber formation. I saw him go down. Marcus Chen had never heard the name Tommy Kellerman, but when Dr. Santos mentioned it to him, he nodded as if she had just confirmed something he already knew. "That was my name then," he said simply, "before I was Marcus." Similar cases filled Dr. Santos's files. Sarah Kowalski, the 8-year-old in Idaho who remembered being a nurse during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. She could describe the exact progression of symptoms, the way the disease would cause victims to develop a distinctive blue-black discoloration around their mouths and fingernails called heliotrope cyanosis. She knew that many patients died not from the disease itself, but from secondary pneumonia infections caused by bacterial superinfection. Sarah could describe the interior layout of hospitals that had been demolished decades before she was born. She knew the names of medications that hadn't been used since the 1920s. She could even sing songs that the nurses had used to keep their spirits up during the worst days of the pandemic, melodies her mother had never heard, but that I later identified in archives of period sheet music. "We had to keep singing," Sarah told Dr. Santos during one session. "If we stopped singing, we would start crying, and if we started crying, we would never stop. So many people died, so many children." But the most disturbing case in Dr. Santos's files was a boy named David Reeves from Portland, Oregon. David had started having memories when he was 4 years old, but these weren't memories of a previous life. They were memories of the time between lives. David described floating in a grey place that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light, where time moved differently, and thoughts became visible things that drifted around like smoke. He talked about the Watchers, beings that looked human but felt wrong, who would come and examine people in this grey place. "They choose who goes back," David told Dr. Santos. "They look inside your head and see all the things you knew before, and if they like what they see, they send you back to learn more things. But you have to forget first. You have to drink the forgetting water." According to David, some people refused to drink the forgetting water and were sent back anyway, forced into new bodies while retaining their memories. "Those are the ones like me," he explained, "the ones who remember things we're not supposed to remember." David claimed that the Watchers were particularly interested in people who had died while working on important projects, people who had possessed valuable skills or knowledge. They keep sending the same people back over and over to work on the same things, but now the Watchers are getting impatient. They're not letting people forget as much as they used to. When Dr. Santos asked David what the Watchers wanted, his answer was chilling. They want to make sure the right people are in the right places when something big happens. They're getting ready for something, and they need all the smart people from before to help them. I spent 3 days going through Dr. Santos's files, documenting case after case of children with impossible memories. But the most disturbing part wasn't the historical accuracy of their recollections. It was what happened when Dr. Santos tried to study them more systematically. I started noticing patterns in 2018, she told me. The children weren't random. They all came from families with specific characteristics. Above average intelligence, parents in technical or scientific fields, geographic locations near major research facilities or military installations. It was as if someone was selecting the families, guiding these reincarnated souls into predetermined circumstances. She'd begun documenting these patterns, preparing a research paper that would have revolutionized our understanding of consciousness and reincarnation. But before she could publish, she received visitors. 3 men in dark suits, she said. They showed me credentials I couldn't verify, from agencies I'd never heard of. They were very polite, very professional. They explained that my research touched on matters of national security, that publishing would be considered an act of treason. They had offered her a choice: cease her research and never speak about it publicly, or face prosecution under the Espionage Act. They had also made it clear that the children in her care could be taken into protective custody for their own safety if she failed to cooperate. They knew details about my cases that weren't in any files, Dr. Santos told me. They knew what the children had said in private sessions, knew about memories the children had shared only with their parents. They had been watching, listening, documenting everything. After the visit, several families had moved away without explanation. Phone numbers were disconnected. Email addresses bounced back. The children simply disappeared from her practice, as if they had never existed. But here's what really terrifies me, Dr. Santos said as our meeting concluded. The patterns I was documenting, they're accelerating. More children are remembering more details, and their memories are becoming more recent. It's as if the barrier between lives is breaking down, as if whatever system was controlling reincarnation is malfunctioning. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper, or as if someone is deliberately weakening that barrier, preparing for something that requires all these old souls to remember who they used to be. As I left her clinic that night, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street with its engine running. When I looked back after walking a block, it was gone, but I had the distinct feeling that our conversation had been monitored, that my visit to Dr. Santos had been noted by the same people who had silenced her research. The children she had described weren't just random cases of past life recall. They were fragments of other lives breaking through, just like the documents had described, and someone had been tracking them all along, cataloguing their memories, ensuring their silence. But why? What was so important about these reincarnated souls that it required decades of surveillance and cover-ups? And what was the something big that David Reeves claimed they were preparing for? I was beginning to understand that my own dreams of Thomas Ellery weren't an isolated phenomenon. They were part of a larger pattern, a systematic program of consciousness manipulation that had been running for nearly a century. And I was starting to suspect that I hadn't found Project Echo by accident. I had been guided to it, led to discover the truth by the same forces that had brought Thomas Ellery's memories into my mind. The question was, did they want me to know the truth, or were they simply using me to serve a purpose I couldn't yet understand? As I dove deeper into the research, my own dreams intensified beyond anything I could have imagined. The woman in yellow became more vivid, more present, more desperate, but she was no longer confined to my sleeping hours. It started with peripheral glimpses, just a flash of yellow fabric in a store window as I walked past, or a figure in my peripheral vision that would vanish when I turned to look directly. I began to think I was losing my mind, that the stress of my investigation was causing hallucinations, but gradually the sightings became more distinct, more undeniable, more interactive. She would be standing behind me when I looked in the bathroom mirror at night, her face pale and sad, her lips moving as if she were trying to tell me something I couldn't hear. Her image was translucent but clear, like a double exposure on an old photograph. When I would spin around to look for her directly, she wouldn't be there. But when I looked back at the mirror, she would still be there, reaching toward me with desperate longing. In the window of a coffee shop near my apartment, she would appear sitting at a table that wasn't there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on mine with an expression that mixed love and urgency and something that looked like warning. Other customers would walk past the window without seeing her, their reflections passing right through her image as if she existed in a different dimension entirely. The most unsettling encounters happened in my car. I would glance in the rearview mirror and see her sitting in the back seat, leaning forward as if trying to get my attention. Her mouth would move urgently, and I would catch fragments of words that seemed to come from the radio static. Remember, the files, they're watching, not safe. But the encounter that nearly caused me to crash my car happened on a rainy Thursday evening, as I was driving home from the Boston Public Library. I had spent the day researching maritime records from the 1920s, looking for any information about Thomas Ellery and Millbrook Harbour. The windshield wipers were creating a hypnotic rhythm, and I was tired from hours of squinting at microfilm when I saw her clearly for the first time in reflected light. She was standing in the middle of the street directly in front of my car, her yellow dress soaked by rain that didn't seem to be falling on her. This time, I could hear her voice clearly, cutting through the sound of rain and traffic and my own panicked breathing. "Thomas," she said, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it from the dreams. "Thomas, you have to stop. They know you're looking. They're coming for you like they came for us before." I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop in the middle of the intersection. Other drivers honked angrily as they swerved around me, but I barely heard them. Margaret was walking toward my car, her expression desperate, her hand outstretched. "The files you found, they're not the beginning," she said, and now I could see that there were tears on her cheeks. "They've been doing this for so much longer than you know. The children, the families, all of it is connected to something bigger, something that started long before Project Echo." She pressed her hand against my windshield, and for a moment I could swear I felt the cold touch of her palm against my forehead. "They killed us to stop us from exposing them in 1925. But death isn't the end for people like us, Thomas. Love doesn't die. Purpose doesn't die. They can kill our bodies, but they can't kill what we are." "Margaret," I whispered, and the sound of my own voice saying her name felt like coming home after a century of wandering. "What happened to us? What did we discover?" But she was already beginning to fade, her image becoming more transparent as car horns blared around me. "Find the lighthouse," she said, her voice growing distant. "Find what we hid beneath our names. But be careful, my love. They have ways of watching now that we never imagined. They can reach into dreams, into memories, into the space between lives." She was gone, leaving me sitting in the middle of a busy intersection with tears streaming down my face and the absolute certainty that I'd just spoken to the woman I'd loved and lost nearly a century ago. I started keeping a more detailed journal, writing down every detail I could remember from the dreams and the sightings. The silver pocket watch had been a gift from Margaret on Thomas's birthday in 1924. The inscription was written in her careful script, and she had saved for 3 months to afford it from a jewellery shop in Portland. The dock where they met had been their special place, where Thomas would wait for her after his duties as harbour master were finished for the day. I could remember conversations we had never had, shared experiences that had never happened to Elias Hart. I remembered the way Margaret laughed, a musical sound that started low and built to something joyous and infectious. I remembered the way she would bite her lower lip when she was thinking, the way she would trace patterns on my hand with her finger when we sat together watching the sunset. I remembered teaching her to tie sailing knots, her small hands fumbling with the rope until she mastered each one. I remembered the night she told me she loved me, standing on that same dock under a full moon, her face glowing with happiness and moonlight. I remembered planning our future together, the house we would build overlooking the harbour, the children we would raise, the life that was stolen from us. But I also remembered darker things. Thomas's growing concern about the strange activity in the harbour, the boats that arrived at night carrying cargo that was never officially documented, the men in dark suits who claimed government authority but carried no credentials that could be verified, the increasing pressure from these men to stop asking questions about their activities. I remembered finding the hidden facility, a nondescript building on an island 3 miles offshore that was marked on no official charts. I remembered sneaking onto that island one night and discovering laboratories filled with equipment I couldn't understand, files describing experiments on human consciousness, photographs of people connected to strange machines. And I remembered the confrontation that had led to Thomas Ellery's death. Most disturbing of all, I started experiencing what I can only describe as memory bleeds. Moments when Thomas Ellery's knowledge would suddenly surface in my consciousness as if it had always been there. I would find myself knowing things I had never learned, remembering skills I had never developed. One morning, I woke up with complete knowledge of how to navigate by the stars, able to identify constellations and calculate positions using methods I had never studied. I could tie complex sailing knots without thinking about the process, my hands moving with muscle memory that belonged to someone else. I found myself able to read people's intentions in a way that felt supernatural, picking up on subtle cues and body language patterns that Thomas had learned through years of dealing with smugglers and criminals in his role as harbour master. I could spot lies instantly, could sense when someone was concealing information or harbouring malicious intent. But the most unsettling development was that I began to understand that my research wasn't random. Every lead I had followed, every document I discovered, every contact I had made, it all felt orchestrated, as if I were following a path that had been laid out for me decades earlier. The antique shop where I had found the pocket watch had received it from an estate sale in Maine just 2 days before I happened to walk past. The declassified files I discovered had been released to the public archives only a week before I found them. Dr. Santos had agreed to meet with me, despite her usual reluctance to discuss her cases with outsiders. It was as if Thomas Ellery's unfinished business was pulling me forward, using my journalistic skills and my modern resources to continue an investigation that had been interrupted by murder in 1925. But I was beginning to suspect that this wasn't entirely natural either. Someone or something wanted me to uncover this information, wanted Thomas Ellery's investigation to continue. The question that haunted me was whether I was being guided by benevolent forces seeking justice, or whether I was being manipulated by the same people who had killed Thomas, used as an unwitting pawn in a game I couldn't understand. When I described my experiences to Margaret during our increasingly frequent encounters, her expression would grow troubled. "They've learned so much since our time," she would tell me. "They can reach into dreams now, plant thoughts and memories, make you believe you're choosing your own path when really you're following theirs." She would appear to me most clearly in reflective surfaces during the late evening hours, when the boundary between day and night seemed thinnest. Her warnings became more urgent as my investigation progressed. The facility we found in 1925, it wasn't the beginning, she told me during one encounter, her image flickering in the window of a darkened storefront. It was just one branch of something much larger. They'd been studying consciousness, studying death, studying the process of souls moving between lives for more than a century. What we stumbled onto was just the tip of an iceberg that goes back to the Civil War, maybe earlier. The research I was conducting during my waking hours began to confirm Margaret's warnings. Historical records showed unexplained government interest in spiritualism and mediumship, dating back to the 1860s. There had been secret investigations into battlefield seances during the Civil War, studies of people who claimed to communicate with the dead, classified research into what military documents euphemistically called post-mortem intelligence gathering. I found references to a Union Army unit called the Spiritual Communications Division that had been tasked with trying to extract strategic information from deceased Confederate officers through mediums and psychics. The unit had been disbanded officially in 1867, but personnel records showed that many of its members had been transferred to other government agencies and had continued similar work under different classifications. By the early 1900s, this research had evolved into systematic studies of people who claimed to remember previous lives. The government had been identifying and tracking reincarnated individuals for decades before Project Echo was even conceived. What I had discovered wasn't a Cold War-era program, but the latest iteration of an effort that had been ongoing for more than 150 years. But why? What was so important about controlling reincarnation that it justified a century and a half of secret research and murder? The answer came to me in fragments, through dreams that felt more like recovered memories than unconscious fantasies. Thomas Ellery hadn't just discovered that the government was experimenting on people with past life memories. He had discovered what they were trying to accomplish with those experiments. They were building an army of the dead, soldiers, scientists, engineers and strategists who could be brought back life after life, retaining their skills and knowledge across multiple incarnations. They were trying to create a permanent class of immortal operatives who could serve the interests of the state indefinitely, death being merely a temporary inconvenience rather than an ending. But the process was imperfect. Most people forgot their previous lives completely, making them useless for the program's purposes. Only a small percentage retained clear memories, and these individuals often became unstable or uncontrollable when they realised what was being done to them. The researchers had been working on methods to improve the retention rate, to ensure that reincarnated operatives would remember their training and remain loyal to their handlers. The experiments Thomas had discovered were early attempts at consciousness programming, ways of imprinting orders and objectives so deeply into a soul that they would survive the transition between lives. Margaret appeared to me again that night, her image clearer and more solid than it had ever been. She was sitting on the edge of my bed, and for the first time I could feel the slight depression in the mattress where her weight rested. "Now you understand," she said, her sea glass eyes reflecting moonlight that seemed to come from somewhere other than my bedroom window. "They didn't just kill us to silence us. They killed us to recruit us. Thomas had the skills they wanted, his ability to detect deception, his knowledge of smuggling operations, his talent for investigation. They needed him to forget his opposition to their program so they could use those skills for their own purposes. But something went wrong," I said, understanding flooding through me. "I remember opposing them, not serving them." Margaret smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her look truly happy since the dreams began. "Love, Thomas. Love is stronger than their programming. Our connection to each other, our commitment to exposing the truth. It survived their attempts to erase it. You came back as yourself, not as their tool." She reached out and touched my face, and her hand felt solid, warm, real. "But they're trying again. Every time you reincarnate, they attempt to capture you, to break down your memories and rebuild you as their agent. This life, they guided you into journalism, gave you the skills to investigate them, but they also planted triggers, ways to control your research, to ensure you would uncover only what they wanted you to find." "Then how do I know what's real?" I asked. "How do I know which thoughts are mine and which are theirs?" "Follow your heart," she said simply. "Follow your love for me, your commitment to the truth, your instinct to protect the innocent. Those are the parts of you they can never touch, never control, never corrupt. Those are the parts that make you Thomas Ellery, no matter what name you wear or what life you live." She was starting to fade again, but before she disappeared completely, she pressed something into my hand. It was solid, metallic, familiar. When I looked down, I was holding a brass key, old and worn, with an intricate pattern carved into its head. "Find the lighthouse," she whispered as her image dissolved. "Find what we hid beneath our names. But remember, my love, they're watching everything now. They have technology we never dreamed of, ways of monitoring thoughts and dreams and the spaces between lives. Trust no one completely, not even yourself. The only truth you can rely on is what your heart tells you when you think of me." I was left alone in my bedroom, holding a brass key that shouldn't exist, with the knowledge that my entire investigation might be an elaborate manipulation designed to serve the very forces I thought I was fighting against. The connection between my dreams and Thomas Ellery's disappearance couldn't be coincidence, but as a journalist trained to verify sources and facts, I needed more than just matching details and impossible encounters with ghosts. I needed to understand the science, the mechanism behind what was happening to me. I needed proof that wouldn't dissolve when examined in the clear light of day. That's when I discovered the work of Dr. Elena Vasquez, a researcher whose name had appeared in the margins of the Project Echo documents, but whose published work had been systematically suppressed and discredited by mainstream academia. Her papers had been published in fringe journals, dismissed as speculative pseudoscience. But reading her theories in light of the classified files I had uncovered, everything began to make terrifying sense. Dr. Vasquez had started her career as a conventional neuroscientist at Stanford in the 1960s, studying brain chemistry and consciousness, but a near-death experience during a laboratory accident in 1968 had changed her research focus dramatically. She began investigating cases of people who claimed to remember previous lives, approaching the phenomenon from a quantum physics perspective rather than a psychological one. Her breakthrough paper, published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 1974, proposed that consciousness wasn't simply produced by the brain, but rather that the brain acted as a kind of quantum receiver, tuning into consciousness that existed independently in what she called morphic fields, structured energy patterns that could store and transmit information across space and time. According to Dr. Vasquez's theory, when someone died, their consciousness didn't disappear, but left what she termed an information imprint, both in the physical locations where they had lived and in their genetic lineage. These imprints contained not just memories, but personality traits, skills, emotional patterns, and what she called purpose signatures, driving motivations that would seek completion across multiple lifetimes. Under normal circumstances, these imprints would fade over time, becoming too weak to influence new incarnations significantly. But Dr. Vasquez believed that strong emotions, particularly those associated with unfinished business, traumatic death, or profound love, could create imprints powerful enough to influence compatible consciousnesses for decades or even centuries. Her most controversial hypothesis concerned what she called intentional reincarnation. She proposed that if the mechanism of consciousness transfer could be understood and controlled, it might be possible to guide specific souls into predetermined genetic lines, essentially recycling individuals with particular skills or knowledge. She even suggested that such a system might occur naturally, with souls gravitating towards circumstances that would allow them to complete interrupted purposes. But her final papers, published between 1975 and 1979, took her research in an even more disturbing direction. She had begun investigating reports of government interest in reincarnation research, tracking a pattern of recruitment and disappearance among researchers in the field. Her last published work suggested that military and intelligence agencies had been studying consciousness transfer since the Civil War, gradually developing methods to identify, track, and potentially control reincarnated individuals. The paper was Dr. Vasquez's last public work. According to academic records, she had taken a position with a private research foundation called the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies in 1980 and had ceased all public research activities. The Institute's address was listed as a post office box in Virginia, and no trace of it could be found in corporate databases or academic directories. But buried in the Project ECHO files, I found extensive reference to a Dr. E.V., who had served as chief consultant on consciousness transfer protocols between 1980 and 1985. The dates matched perfectly with Dr. Vasquez's disappearance from academic circles. There were also fragments of research reports that bore her distinctive theoretical framework and terminology. They had recruited her. The CIA had brought Dr. Elena Vasquez into Project Echo to help them understand and control reincarnation itself, and according to the files, her research had been extraordinarily successful. Internal memos described breakthrough discoveries in soul mapping and consciousness trajectory prediction. They had developed methods for identifying individuals with strong reincarnation potential, tracking specific consciousness patterns across multiple lifetimes, and even influencing where and when particular souls would be reborn. But the most chilling discovery was a research protocol labelled Operational Immortality, a systematic program to ensure that valuable intelligence assets would reincarnate with their skills and memories intact. The protocol involved what the documents called deep programming during the dying process, using electromagnetic field manipulation and chemical compounds to imprint specific directives into a person's consciousness before death. According to the theory, if these directives were embedded deeply enough, they would survive the transition between lives and guide the reincarnated individual to seek out their former handlers, report for duty, and continue their previous assignments. Death would become merely a temporary interruption in service rather than an end to usefulness. The implications were staggering. What if reincarnation wasn't random? What if some souls were being deliberately guided back into specific families, specific circumstances, to serve purposes they didn't even understand? What if entire lineages were being used as breeding grounds for reincarnated operatives? I began researching my own family history with new urgency, looking for patterns that might indicate government interest across generations. What I found made my blood run cold. My grandfather, Robert Hart, had been a Navy cryptographer during World War II, who had died in a car accident in 1956, under circumstances that had never been fully explained. His personnel files showed that he had been working on classified communications projects up until his death, and several of his colleagues had reported that he had been acting strangely in the weeks before the accident, claiming that he was being watched and that his work was being used for purposes he couldn't support. My father, David Hart, had shown an uncanny aptitude for mathematics and logic from an early age. Despite having no formal training in these areas, he had been recruited by the NSA straight out of college and had worked on cryptanalysis projects for 15 years before leaving government service abruptly in 1985. The same year, Project Echo was terminated. He had never spoken about his government work, claiming it was all classified, and he had died of a sudden heart attack in 2010 at the age of 62. And now there was me, Elias Hart, investigative journalist with an inexplicable talent for uncovering government conspiracies, guided by dreams of a previous life to discover a program that had been hidden for decades. The pattern was too clear to be coincidental. We weren't a normal family experiencing random reincarnations. We were a genetic line that had been cultivated and manipulated for at least 3 generations, with each incarnation designed to serve the intelligence community's interests. Robert's cryptographic skills had been preserved and enhanced in David, who had been guided into similar work. David's analytical abilities had been passed to me, along with investigative instincts that had been honed by Thomas Ellery's experiences nearly a century earlier. But something had gone wrong with the programming. Instead of serving my handlers loyally, I was investigating them. Instead of accepting my role as a reincarnated asset, I was exposing their system. Thomas Ellery's love for Margaret, his commitment to truth and justice, had proven stronger than their consciousness programming. The question that haunted me was, how many other families were there? How many people were living lives they thought were their own, following paths that had been laid out for them by handlers they had never seen? How many government operatives, scientists, military officers, and intelligence analysts were actually reincarnated souls who had been serving the same masters across multiple lifetimes? Margaret appeared to me again that night, her image manifesting in the bathroom mirror as I prepared for bed. She looked older somehow, more tired, as if the effort of reaching across the divide between life and death was draining her strength. "You're beginning to understand the scope of it," she said, her voice carrying a note of profound sadness. "They've been doing this for so long, Thomas. Centuries of carefully guided reincarnations, generations of families bred to produce the souls they need. We discovered just one small piece of a machine that spans continents and lifetimes." "How do we stop it?" I asked. "How do we break a system that controls death itself?" Margaret's reflection smiled, but it was a sad, knowing expression. "We can't stop it, my love. It's too big, too entrenched, too protected by powers that transcend any single government or organisation. But we can expose it. We can make people aware that their lives might not be their own, that their choices might not be freely made. Knowledge is the only weapon we have, she continued. If enough people understand what's being done to them, if enough souls remember their true purposes instead of their programmed ones, the system might begin to break down from within. She pressed her hand against the mirror and I placed mine against it from my side. For a moment I could swear I felt her warmth. But be careful, Thomas. They know you've remembered. They know you've broken free of their programming. They'll try to recapture you, to reset your memories and start the process over again. And if they can't control you... She trailed off, her image beginning to flicker. If they can't control me, what? Then they'll do what they did before, she whispered as her reflection faded. They'll kill you and wait for you to come back, hoping the next incarnation will be more compliant. I was left alone with the reflection of my own face in the mirror. But for just a moment I could have sworn I saw Thomas Ellery looking back at me. A man from another time, another life, bound to me by purpose and love and a truth that had survived nearly a century of attempts to bury it. The brass key Margaret had given me was real, solid, undeniably physical. Whatever was happening to me transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead, between memory and reality, between one lifetime and the next. And that meant the lighthouse in Maine, the place where Thomas and Margaret had hidden their evidence, might contain more than just historical artifacts. It might contain proof of a conspiracy that reached across generations, proof that could finally expose what they had died trying to reveal. I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. Whatever connection I had to Thomas Ellery, whatever unfinished business was drawing me into his memories, I knew I wouldn't find peace, or answers, until I followed it to its source. The brass key Margaret had given me felt warm in my pocket, a constant reminder that some truths could only be discovered by walking the same paths that had been walked before. I took a leave of absence from the Globe, claiming I needed time to work on a book project. My editor was understanding. Investigative journalists often burned out from the stress of pursuing difficult stories, and I had been showing signs of strain for months. I booked a flight to Portland, Maine, and rented a car for the drive to what remained of Millbrook Harbour. The journey felt like travelling backward through time. As I drove the winding coastal road, past pine forests and rocky shores that looked exactly as they had in Thomas's memories, I could feel his presence growing stronger. By the time I reached the town limits, I was no longer sure where Elias Hart ended and Thomas Ellery began. Millbrook Harbour had changed dramatically since the 1920s. What had once been a working fishing village populated by weathered men who understood the sea's moods was now a quaint tourist destination, complete with boutique shops selling nautical-themed souvenirs and restaurants advertising authentic Maine lobster experience to visitors from Boston and New York. The harbour itself had been expanded and modernised, with floating docks and a marina that could accommodate pleasure boats worth more than most houses. Tour boats departed hourly, taking visitors on scenic cruises past islands that had once hidden government secrets. The working boats that remained were clean and well maintained, nothing like the salt-stained, functional vessels that had filled the harbour in Thomas's time. But underneath the modern veneer I could still see the bones of the place I knew from my dreams. The lighthouse was still there, now automated and maintained by the Coast Guard as a historical landmark. The red trim around the windows had been faithfully restored to match historical photographs, and standing at its base looking out over the harbour, I felt a profound sense of homecoming that defied rational explanation. But it was the discovery of the original harbour master's dock that truly took my breath away. Hidden behind the modern marina, accessible only by a path overgrown with beach grass and wild roses, was what remained of the old working harbour. Most of the original structures had been demolished or had collapsed from decades of neglect, but one dock remained, partially intact and forgotten by the tourism industry that had transformed the rest of the town. The same weathered grey planks, many missing or sagging under their own weight, the same brass cleats, green with oxidation from decades of salt air. Even the same pattern of weathering and decay that I had memorised from countless dreams. Standing on that dock, looking out toward the lighthouse, I could feel the ghost of every memory Thomas had formed in this place. The emotions hit me like a physical blow. joy at seeing Margaret walk down this dock toward me, her yellow dress bright against the grey wood, the weight of the engagement ring in my pocket as I planned to propose, the terror of that final night when I had hidden the evidence that would cost us both our lives. In the ruins of an old boathouse at the end of the dock, I found the first piece of physical proof I had been seeking. Carved into a support beam, nearly obscured by peeling paint and decades of weather damage, were the initials TE plus MC, surrounded by a rough heart. Below it, in Thomas's careful script, was a date, July 15th, 1925. 3 days before Thomas Ellery had disappeared forever. I traced the carved letters with my finger, and the sensation was like touching a live wire. These were Thomas's hands that had carved these letters, driven by the same love that had survived his death and found its way into my dreams. This was proof that he had existed, that Margaret had existed, that their love had been real and powerful enough to transcend death itself. But the brass key Margaret had given me was meant for something more than carved initials. I examined the support beam more carefully, looking for hidden compartments or concealed mechanisms. The wood was soft with age and rot, but there was a section near the carved heart that seemed different, harder, as if it had been treated with some kind of preservative. Using the brass key like a probe, I discovered that the treated section could be pried away from the beam. Behind it was a small metal box, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture for nearly a century. My hands shook as I unwrapped it, knowing that I was about to see evidence that Thomas Ellery had died to protect. The box contained photographs, documents, and artifacts that made my blood turn to ice. Pictures of men in military uniforms standing over what appeared to be surgical tables, with unconscious subjects connected to strange electrical devices that looked like primitive versions of modern brain scanning equipment. Documents describing consciousness transfer experiments and memory implantation protocols, using techniques that seemed decades ahead of 1920s technology. But the most disturbing items were the personal effects, jewellery, clothing, and identification documents belonging to people who were listed in the experimental records as subjects terminated during consciousness extraction procedures. These weren't just research subjects who had volunteered for experiments. These were people who had been murdered so their memories and skills could be harvested and potentially transferred to new hosts. One folder contained detailed psychological profiles of what the documents called high-value reincarnation candidates, individuals whose skills, knowledge, or personality traits made them worth preserving across multiple lifetimes. The profiles read like recruitment files for an immortal intelligence service: cryptographers, linguists, engineers, strategists, and investigators whose abilities could serve the state indefinitely. Thomas Ellery's name was in that folder, along with the psychological assessment that praised his exceptional analytical abilities, natural investigative instincts, and proven loyalty to truth over authority. There was also a note suggesting that his romantic attachment to Margaret Cole represented a potential vulnerability that would need to be addressed before his recruitment into the program. Another folder contained correspondence between the researchers and their government handlers, dating back to 1917. The program wasn't just a 1920s experiment. It was part of a systematic effort that had been ongoing since at least the Civil War. References in the letters mentioned previous successful extractions and established reincarnation tracking protocols that suggested the technology had been in use for decades. But the most chilling discovery was a map of the United States marked with dozens of red pins, each representing what the documents called active monitoring stations. These weren't just research facilities. They were observation posts designed to track reincarnated individuals throughout their new lives, identifying when memories from previous incarnations began to surface. Millbrook Harbour was marked with a red pin, but so were locations across the country: a mental health facility in California, a private school in Virginia, a military base in Colorado, a research hospital in Illinois. The network was vast, systematic, and still operational as of 1925. If the program had continued to evolve over the past century, there was no telling how extensive it might have become. As I photographed each document with my phone, uploading them to multiple secure cloud storage accounts, I began to understand the true scope of what Thomas and Margaret had uncovered. This wasn't just a government program experimenting with reincarnation. This was a shadow organisation that had been manipulating the afterlife itself for more than a century, building an army of immortal operatives whose loyalty transcended death. And I was one of them. At the Millbrook Harbour Town Hall, I requested access to any records related to Thomas Ellery's disappearance, hoping to find additional information that might not have made it into the official police reports. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in the town her entire life, was initially hesitant to discuss the case. "That's old business," she said, studying me with sharp blue eyes. "Nobody talks much about that summer anymore. Bad things happened, and folks prefer to let sleeping dogs lie." But when I explained that I was researching local history for a book about maritime mysteries, she softened slightly. "Well, I suppose it's been long enough, and you do look familiar somehow. Have we met before?" She brought out a box of materials that hadn't been digitised, records that existed only in the town's physical archives. Most of the police reports I'd already seen in online databases, but there were other documents that painted a more complete picture of Thomas Ellery's final weeks. Personal effects that had been found in his office after his disappearance included a logbook detailing unusual boat traffic in and out of the harbour, handwritten notes describing government men who claimed federal authority but provided no proper credentials, and most importantly, a sealed letter addressed to Margaret Cole that had never been delivered. But it was Thomas's official reports to the Harbour Commission that revealed the true extent of what he had discovered. For 6 weeks before his disappearance, he had been documenting systematic violations of maritime law by vessels that arrived at night carrying unmarked cargo. When he had attempted to inspect these shipments, he'd been turned away with threats of federal prosecution for interfering with national security operations. Thomas's final report, filed just 2 days before he vanished, described his suspicion that the harbour was being used as a smuggling point for human trafficking. He had observed unconscious individuals being transferred from boats to unmarked trucks, always under the supervision of armed men who wore no identifying uniforms or badges. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that summer," Mrs. Patterson said as I read through the documents. "Said there were strangers in town asking questions, making people nervous. Government men, she called them, though they never showed proper identification. After Thomas disappeared, they all left town, and nobody ever talked about it again." She paused, studying my face with an expression that made me uncomfortable. "You know, you really do look familiar, the eyes especially. Reminds me of old photographs my grandmother kept from those days." I asked if she could show me those photographs, and Mrs. Patterson led me to a back room where the Historical Society kept its archives. Among dusty boxes of local memorabilia, she found an album of photographs from the 1920s. Most were typical small-town scenes: fishing boats in the harbour, families at church socials, children playing on the beach. But one photograph made my heart stop completely. It was a group shot taken at what appeared to be a town festival in the summer of 1925. In the centre of the image, unmistakably recognisable despite the vintage clothing and different hairstyle, was a face I saw in the mirror every morning. Thomas Ellery looked exactly like me, or rather I looked exactly like him. Not similar, not reminiscent. Identical in every detail except for the period clothing and the serious expression of a man who knew he was in danger. "That's Thomas," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing to the figure, "and that's his fiancée, Margaret Cole." She indicated a young woman in a yellow dress standing beside him, her hand resting on his arm, looking at him with an expression of profound love. It was the woman from my dreams, exactly as I had seen her countless times. Every detail of her face was perfect, from the small scar above her left eyebrow to the beauty mark on her right cheek. "Margaret lived her whole life in this town after Thomas disappeared," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Never married, though Lord knows she had plenty of suitors. She kept working as the schoolteacher, kept waiting for him to come back. Used to walk down to that old dock every evening until she was too frail to make the trip." According to Mrs. Patterson, Margaret had died in 1972 at the age of 70, but before her death, she had donated several boxes of personal items to the Historical Society, including a sealed letter that she had requested never be opened unless Thomas returned to claim it. She said it was for Thomas in case he ever came back, Mrs. Patterson explained, producing a yellowed envelope from the archives. Made us promise to keep it sealed until he claimed it. Of course, we all knew he was never coming back, but Margaret, she never stopped believing. The letter was addressed simply to Thomas, in Margaret's careful script. Mrs. Patterson handed it to me with a strange expression on her face. "Maybe it's time someone read it," she said quietly. "You've got his eyes, you know. Exactly his eyes." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope that had waited nearly 50 years for the right person to claim it. Inside, on paper yellowed with age, was a message that confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. "My dearest Thomas, they told me you were gone, that you drowned in the harbour you knew better than anyone who ever lived. But I've seen you in my dreams, walking those docks, still waiting for me to join you. If you ever find this letter, if you ever come back to me in whatever form love allows, know that I never stopped believing in you. I kept our promise. I never told anyone what you discovered that night, what you found in those crates they were smuggling through our harbour. I burned the photographs like you asked me to, destroyed every piece of evidence except for what you hid in our special place. You said if anything happened to you, if they silenced you for getting too close to the truth, that someday someone would come looking for answers. You said they couldn't kill an idea, couldn't kill love, couldn't kill the truth forever. I don't understand all of what you told me that night about the experiments they were doing, about the people they were bringing back from death to serve them again. But I understand that you loved me enough to risk everything to protect innocent people from their evil. And I want you to know that I am still yours, in this life and whatever lives may come. I've learned things since you've been gone, Thomas. I've watched them, listened to their conversations when they thought no one could hear. They can bring people back, but they can't control love. They can transfer memories and skills from one life to another, but they can't transfer the heart. That's why they failed with you, why you chose truth over their orders. Love made you stronger than their programming. Look for me in the next life, my darling. Look for a woman who loves you before she knows your name, who dreams of yellow dresses and lighthouse beams. I'll be waiting for you to find me, waiting to continue what they interrupted. Forever yours across every lifetime, Margaret." I read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Margaret had known. Somehow she had understood the true nature of the program that had killed Thomas, and she had been preparing for their reunion across the boundaries of death itself. But more than that, she had confirmed what I was beginning to suspect about myself. I wasn't just experiencing Thomas Ellery's memories randomly. I was Thomas Ellery, brought back to complete the mission that had been interrupted by murder nearly a century ago. The question that remained was whether my investigation was being guided by my own free will and Margaret's love, or whether I was still serving the same forces that had killed us both, following a script that had been written for me before I was born. I drove back to the abandoned dock as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the harbour that made the modern marina look ghostly and insubstantial. The evidence I had discovered in the boathouse was more than enough to expose the conspiracy Thomas had died investigating, but I needed to understand how it connected to the present day, how the program had evolved over the decades since 1925. Using my phone's camera, I had documented every page of Thomas's hidden files, uploading them to multiple secure cloud storage accounts and sending copies to trusted colleagues at the Globe. But as I prepared to leave Maine and return to Boston to write the story that would finally vindicate Thomas's sacrifice, I realised I was no longer alone. The black sedan had been following me since I left the town hall, maintaining a careful distance but never losing sight of my rental car. When I stopped at the dock, it parked at the other end of the harbour road, too far away for me to see the occupants but close enough to monitor my movements. I felt a familiar chill, the same sensation Thomas had experienced in his final weeks when he had realised he was being watched. History was repeating itself, and I was walking down the same path that had led to his murder. But this time, I had advantages Thomas hadn't possessed. I had modern technology, secure communications, and a network of journalists who knew where I was and what I was investigating. If something happened to me, the story would still be told. I sat on the dock where Thomas and Margaret had carved their initials, watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the harbour as darkness fell. The brass key was warm in my pocket, and Margaret's letter was folded carefully in my jacket. For the first time since the dreams had started, I felt a sense of completion, as if I'd finally fulfilled the purpose that had drawn me back to this life. That's when my phone rang. The number was blocked, but the voice that answered when I picked up was calm, professional, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the same tone I had heard in Thomas's memories, the voice of a government handler addressing a valuable asset. "Mr. Hart," the voice said, "or should I call you Thomas? We've been waiting for you to complete your investigation. We're impressed by your thoroughness, your dedication to uncovering the truth. It's exactly the kind of investigative skill we value in our organisation." "Who is this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We're the people your previous incarnation was working for before he became distracted by personal attachments. We're the reason you were brought back, Elias. The reason you were guided into journalism, given the skills to uncover precisely what you've uncovered." The implications hit me like a physical blow. My investigation hadn't been an act of rebellion against Thomas's murderers. It had been orchestrated by them, designed to test whether I had retained his investigative abilities across the boundary of death. Thomas Ellery was a valuable asset who was compromised by emotional attachments, the voice continued. His romantic involvement with Margaret Cole interfered with his objectivity, caused him to oppose operations he should have supported. We had hoped that death and reincarnation would reset his loyalties, but it appears that some connections transcend our current understanding of consciousness transfer. I looked out across the harbour, remembering Thomas's final night, when he had hidden the evidence that would eventually lead me back to this same dock nearly a century later. "You killed him," I said. "We recycled him," the voice corrected. "Death is merely a transition for individuals of your calibre, Thomas. We've been perfecting the process for more than 150 years. You've been serving our organisation across multiple lifetimes, though you don't remember most of them. Thomas Ellery was actually your third incarnation in our service." The revelation was staggering. Not only was I a reincarnated intelligence asset, but Thomas hadn't been my first life in government service. I was part of a program that had been using my soul for more than a century. Hello there, fellow truth seekers. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world. I'm grateful you're here with us. If this is your first time listening to Sleep Theories, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories they don't want you to know. Now, let's uncover a truth that's been buried for decades. My name is Rachel Linwood, and I'm about to tell you something that will change how you think about environmental disasters forever. I'm 35, a freelance journalist who specialises in environmental research, and 3 months ago, I thought I was investigating a simple case of corporate negligence. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Standing on what used to be 99th Street in Love Canal, New York, I watched weeds push through cracked asphalt where children once played. The October wind carried a smell I couldn't quite place, something sweet and chemical, like old paint mixed with decay. Nature was reclaiming this poisoned ground, but slowly, carefully, as if even the plants knew something was terribly wrong here. They called it a tragedy. The textbooks, the documentaries, the official reports, they all paint the same picture of corporate irresponsibility and government oversight failure. But the deeper I dug into the files, the witness testimonies, the timeline of events, the more I realised that what happened here wasn't an accident. It wasn't negligence. It was something else entirely. Something planned, something deliberate, something that goes to the very heart of how our government views its own citizens. The official story is neat, contained, sanitised for public consumption. But the real story is still buried beneath layers of classified documents, sealed court records, and the testimonies of people who've been told to stay quiet for nearly 50 years. This is that story. Let me start with what they want you to know. In the early 1940s, Hooker Chemical Company began using an abandoned canal in Niagara Falls, New York, as a dump site for industrial waste. Over the course of more than a decade, they buried approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste in steel drums, then covered it with clay and soil. In 1953, facing pressure from a growing population and the need for new schools, the Niagara Falls School Board approached Hooker Chemical about purchasing the land. Hooker sold the property for the symbolic price of $1, but here's where the official story gets interesting. They included a clause in the deed that absolved them of any future liability for the buried chemicals. They warned the school board. They told them about the waste. The school board built anyway. By the 1970s, residents in the area began reporting an unusual number of health problems. Birth defects, miscarriages, cancer clusters, mysterious rashes, and neurological issues plagued the community. Children playing in their backyards developed chemical burns. Basements filled with strange-smelling sludge during heavy rains. In 1978, after mounting pressure from residents and media attention, President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal a federal health emergency. It was the first time in US history that such a declaration was made for a man-made disaster. Hundreds of families were evacuated, their homes purchased by the government, their neighbourhood turned into a ghost town. That's the official story. Corporate greed, government incompetence, innocent victims. A tragedy, yes, but ultimately a lesson learned about proper waste disposal and environmental protection. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not for me. Not when I started finding documents that didn't fit the narrative. My first clue came from a Freedom of Information Act request I filed with the EPA. I was looking for routine correspondence about the cleanup efforts, expecting to find bureaucratic memos about soil samples and water testing. Instead, buried in a stack of heavily redacted documents, I found a memo dated March 15th, 1956, 22 years before the federal health emergency. The memo from an EPA predecessor agency referenced ongoing health monitoring protocols and baseline establishment for long-term exposure studies. They knew. They knew in 1956 what those chemicals would do to people, but they told the public in 1978. I started making phone calls to former residents, many now scattered across the country. Most wouldn't talk. Those who had shared stories that never made it into the official reports. Stories about government officials taking soil samples from their yards in the early 1960s without explanation. Stories about forms they were asked to fill out about their children's behaviour and health. Forms that were supposedly for routine community health surveys that no other neighbourhood seemed to receive. Margaret Kowalski, now 83 and living in Buffalo, remembered it clearly. They came with clipboards, she told me over the phone, her voice still sharp despite her age. Official-looking men in suits. They asked about Tommy's grades, about his moods, about whether he had trouble sleeping or concentrating. Said it was for some university study. But why just our neighbourhood? Why just us? Why indeed? The deeper I dug, the more questions arose. My FOIA requests to various agencies began yielding fragments of documents from the 1960s, most so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art in black marker, but occasionally a phrase would slip through, a sentence that didn't belong in routine environmental monitoring reports. One document from 1963, originating from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, mentioned bio-response tracking and controlled exposure zone establishment. Another, from 1965, contained a budget line item for behavioural assessment protocols at Love Canal site. But the document that stopped me cold was an engineer's memo from 1961. The engineer, whose name was redacted, was writing to his supervisor about irregularities he'd noticed during what appeared to be routine soil surveys at Love Canal. The memo read, "Continued anomalies in disposal patterns suggest multiple origin points. Barrels in Sector 7 unmarked with company identifiers. Chemical composition inconsistent with Hooker manifest logs. Unknown origin of approximately 200 containers discovered during September survey. No record of transfer from Hooker Chemical to disposal site. Recommend investigation into non-corporate depositor." Non-corporate depositor. That phrase haunted me for weeks. Who else had been dumping chemicals at Love Canal? And why weren't they mentioned in any of the official histories? I started cross-referencing dates with other government activities in the area during the early 1950s. That's when I found the connection to Plum Island Animal Disease Centre, the federal research facility located on a small island off the coast of Long Island. Plum Island, officially dedicated to studying animal diseases, has long been the subject of speculation about biological weapons research. Transportation logs from 1951 and 1952, obtained through a separate FOIA request, showed regular truck convoys travelling from Plum Island to various disposal sites in upstate New York. The logs listed Love Canal as a secondary containment location for overflow materials. The timing was perfect. Just before Hooker sold the land to the school board, just as families were beginning to move into the area in larger numbers. Someone had been using Love Canal as a dump site for materials that weren't supposed to exist, materials that came from facilities conducting research that wasn't supposed to be happening. But materials for what? And more importantly, were the families who moved there really victims of an accident? Or were they participants in an experiment they never consented to? 3 weeks into my investigation, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was gravelly, careful, belonging to a man who identified himself only as Robert, and claimed to be a retired Army logistics officer. He'd heard about my research through mutual contacts in the veterans community and wanted to meet. We met at a diner in Syracuse, far enough from Love Canal to feel safe, close enough that Robert could point toward Niagara Falls and say, "That's where they tested it." Robert, who appeared to be in his 70s and wore the careful posture of a man who'd spent decades keeping secrets, had worked in chemical logistics for the Army from 1949 to 1975. His job involved coordinating the disposal of various materials from research facilities, including Plum Island, Fort Detrick, and smaller laboratories scattered across the northeast. Love Canal wasn't just a dump site, he told me over coffee that grew cold as his story unfolded. It was overflow from other projects that were generating waste faster than we could process it through normal channels. According to Robert, in the early days of the Cold War, the military was conducting extensive research into what they called area denial compounds, chemicals that could be used to incapacitate enemy forces or civilian populations without permanent damage. The research was part of a broader program that included psychological warfare, crowd control, and what military documents euphemistically called population management techniques. Robert explained, the problem was disposal. These weren't standard industrial chemicals. They were experimental compounds, some designed to affect neurological function, others to disrupt behavioural patterns. You couldn't just pour them down a drain or bury them in a regular landfill. They needed special containment, special monitoring. But budget constraints and the sheer volume of waste being generated by multiple research programs meant that some materials ended up in civilian disposal sites. Love Canal, with its existing industrial waste and planned development, provided perfect cover. The beauty of it, Robert said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disgust, was that if anyone ever got sick, it would look like industrial contamination. Hooker Chemical would take the blame. The real research materials would disappear into the background noise. When I asked Robert about monitoring, his expression darkened. You don't dump experimental chemicals and walk away. You monitor, you study the effects, you collect data. That's when he told me about the school. According to Robert, the decision to build the 99th Street Elementary School directly on top of the waste site wasn't just cost-saving or poor planning, it was strategic. Schools provided perfect monitoring opportunities, regular health checkups, academic performance tracking, behavioural assessments, and parental questionnaires about children's development. You want to know the long-term effects of low-level chemical exposure on developing minds? Robert asked. Build a school on top of your dump site and watch the kids for 20 years. I left the diner with more questions than answers, but Robert had given me a new direction for my research. I started looking for evidence of systematic monitoring at Love Canal, and I found it in the most unlikely place, the university archive. Buried in the papers of a retired psychology professor at the University at Buffalo, I discovered a folder labelled Niagara Region Behavioural Study, 1971 to 1976. The study, funded by a grant from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, tracked behavioural patterns, academic performance, and social development among elementary school children in the Love Canal area. The study's methodology was sophisticated, comparing Love Canal children to control groups from other neighbourhoods, and tracking dozens of variables over multiple years. But what struck me wasn't the thoroughness of the research, it was the timing. The study began in 1971, 7 years before the health emergency was declared, at a time when officials supposedly didn't know there was any danger. The study's conclusions, buried in academic language and statistical analysis, painted a disturbing picture. Children in the Love Canal area showed higher rates of attention deficit, learning disabilities, aggressive behaviour, and what the researchers termed socialisation difficulties compared to control groups. But here's the truly chilling part. The study's recommendation section suggested that the behavioural differences observed in Love Canal children might be useful for developing environmental management techniques for future urban planning projects. They weren't just watching the children suffer, they were learning from it. As my research deepened, I kept encountering references to dates and programs that seemed familiar. The timeline of Love Canal's development, from initial chemical dumping in the early 1950s through the health emergency in 1978, overlapped almost perfectly with one of the most notorious government programs in American history, MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control research program, operated from 1953 to 1973. While most people know about the LSD experiments and psychological torture techniques developed under MK-Ultra, fewer are aware of its sister program, MK-Naomi, which focused on biological and chemical weapons research. A document I obtained through a FOIA request to the CIA, released in 2001 but heavily redacted, contained a section titled Phase B, Environmental Delivery Systems. The document, dated 1958, outlined research into chemical influence trials utilising environmental integration methods with specific reference to upstate New York test sites. The language was bureaucratic and clinical, but the implications were clear. The CIA was researching ways to deliver mind-altering chemicals through environmental exposure, contaminated water supplies, soil contamination, and airborne dispersal. They needed test sites where they could monitor long-term effects on human subjects without those subjects knowing they were being tested. Love Canal fit the profile perfectly. I found additional confirmation in the personal papers of Dr. Ewan Cameron, the psychiatrist who conducted some of MK-Ultra's most notorious experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. In a letter dated 1956, Cameron mentioned collaborative research opportunities with Army Chemical Corps regarding environmental exposure protocols, and referenced meetings with officials regarding the Niagara Project. The Niagara Project. Not Niagara Falls in general, the Niagara Project singular, specific, deliberate. But the smoking gun came from an unlikely source. The personal diary of a mid-level CIA administrator named James Morrison, whose papers were donated to a university library by his family after his death in 1998. Morrison's diary entries from 1962 to 1965 contained casual references to visiting the canal site and reviewing behavioural modification data from the school population. One entry, dated September 1963, was particularly revealing. Visited canal site with Dr. Patterson. Children's behavioural data shows promising results. Attention span reduction averaging 23% compared to control groups. Memory formation appears impaired but not catastrophically. Recommend continuation of current exposure levels through 1968 academic year. They were experimenting on children. For years. Deliberately exposing them to chemicals designed to alter their cognitive function and behavioural patterns, then studying the results like lab rats in a maze. But why? What was the ultimate goal of creating a generation of cognitively impaired children in a small working-class neighbourhood in upstate New York? The answer, I believe, lies in the broader context of Cold War domestic policy and the government's growing interest in what military planners called population management. As I continued my research, a disturbing pattern emerged. Love Canal wasn't randomly selected for this massive human experiment. It was carefully chosen based on the demographics of its residents. The neighbourhood was predominantly working class, with a high percentage of immigrants from Eastern Europe. Many residents had limited education and few resources to challenge government authority. They were, in the cold calculation of social planners, ideal test subjects, numerous enough to provide statistically significant data, isolated enough to contain any problems, and powerless enough to be safely ignored if things went wrong. Internal documents from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, obtained through a FOIA request, revealed that alternative sites for the 99th Street Elementary School were considered and rejected. 3 other locations were deemed more suitable from an engineering perspective and safer for long-term use. But the Love Canal site was selected because it was more cost-effective and offered unique research opportunities. The HUD documents also revealed something else, the demographic analysis that influenced the site selection. The analysis, conducted in 1952, described the Love Canal area population as stable, compliant, and unlikely to generate adverse publicity. It noted that residents had limited political connections and low propensity for legal action. In other words, they chose Love Canal because they believed the residents wouldn't fight back. This wasn't just environmental racism, it was social engineering on a massive scale. The government had identified a population they considered expendable and used them as test subjects in a multi-decade experiment designed to understand how chemical exposure could be used to control human behaviour. But the experiment went beyond simple chemical exposure. Documents I found in the archives of the Niagara County Health Department revealed systematic efforts to study and manipulate the social dynamics of the Love Canal community. Starting in 1958, government contractors began conducting regular community surveys that were actually designed to measure social cohesion, political awareness, and collective action potential. The surveys tracked which residents were most likely to organise neighbourhood activities, who had influence with local officials, and which families were most trusted by their neighbours. Armed with this information, government agents began subtle interventions designed to disrupt community organisation and prevent residents from collectively identifying the source of their health problems. Natural community leaders were offered jobs that required them to move away from the neighbourhood. Local organisations that might have investigated health issues were either co-opted or undermined through the introduction of divisive personalities. The most chilling document I found was a 1969 memo from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, outlining what they called social fragmentation protocols. The memo described techniques for preventing affected communities from developing coherent narratives of causation and maintaining research integrity through population management. They were actively working to prevent Love Canal residents from understanding what was happening to them. Margaret Kowalski, the former resident I'd spoken with earlier, confirmed this when I called her back with more specific questions. There was always something, she recalled. Right when people started talking about organising a meeting to discuss the health problems, suddenly there'd be some drama. Neighbours would start fighting over property lines, or somebody would spread rumours about someone else having an affair. It was like the community could never come together long enough to focus on what was really important. When I asked Margaret if she remembered any new people moving into the neighbourhood during the 1960s, people who seemed particularly interested in community affairs, her voice got quiet. There was a couple, she said slowly, the Richardsons. Moved in around 1965. Real friendly, always organising block parties and trying to get involved in everything. But looking back, they asked a lot of questions about how people felt, who they trusted, what they were worried about, and they never seemed to get sick like the rest of us. Social engineering, population control, human experimentation disguised as urban development. The scope of what had been done to the Love Canal community was staggering, but I was beginning to understand that it was just one part of a larger program designed to study and control American civilian populations. The question was, how far did it go? And more importantly, was it still happening? In 1980, 2 years after President Carter's health emergency declaration, Love Canal became one of the first sites designated under the newly created Superfund program. The cleanup, which officially lasted until 2004, cost over $400 million and involved removing contaminated soil, installing drainage systems, and constructing a complex containment system around the remaining buried waste. But as I researched the cleanup process, I found evidence that the real goal wasn't environmental remediation, it was evidence destruction. The first red flag was the secrecy surrounding the cleanup operations. Unlike most Superfund sites, where cleanup activities are heavily documented and open to public scrutiny, Love Canal was designated a national security sensitive site, allowing federal agencies to classify most records related to the cleanup process. Former EPA contractor Michael Torres, who worked on the Love Canal cleanup from 1985 to 1990, agreed to speak with me on condition of anonymity. According to Torres, large portions of the cleanup involved activities that had nothing to do with environmental protection. We weren't just removing contaminated soil, Torres explained during a phone conversation. There were specific areas where we were told to locate and extract particular materials, metal containers, file boxes, equipment that looked like monitoring devices. The stuff we pulled out didn't look like industrial waste. It looked like research materials. Torres described finding buried concrete chambers that contained sophisticated monitoring equipment, some of it still functional after decades underground. The chambers were connected to the elementary school through a network of underground cables that had been used to transmit data from sensors placed throughout the school building. They had been monitoring everything, Torres said. Air quality in individual classrooms, chemical concentrations in the playground soil, even the drinking water fountains. Everything was wired up like a giant laboratory. The monitoring equipment and data storage devices were immediately classified and removed by federal agents. Torres and his fellow workers were required to sign additional confidentiality agreements and were told that discussing what they had found would violate national security laws. But the most disturbing discovery came in 1987, when cleanup crews working in the area beneath the former 99th Street Elementary School uncovered what construction logs described as a vaulted chemical reserve. The chamber, constructed in 1952 according to date stamps on the concrete, contained hundreds of chemical containers that didn't match any of Hooker Chemical's disposal records. The containers bore markings from various military research facilities, including Fort Detrick, the Army's Biological Warfare Center, and laboratory codes that Torres later learned belonged to CIA research contractors. Some containers held chemicals that had never been manufactured for commercial use, compounds that existed only in research laboratories studying behavioral modification and population control. That's when I realized we weren't cleaning up an industrial accident, Torres told me. We were cleaning up the evidence of a government program that was never supposed to have existed. The cleanup crews were ordered to incinerate the military and CIA materials at extremely high temperatures, ensuring that no trace of the original compounds would remain for future analysis. The incineration was conducted under military supervision, and the resulting ash was transported to an undisclosed location for final disposal. Meanwhile, soil samples that might have revealed the true nature and extent of the contamination were altered or destroyed before they could be independently analysed. Community groups that demanded access to cleanup data were told that the information was classified for national security reasons. By 2004, when the cleanup was officially declared complete, virtually all evidence of the government's role in creating and maintaining Love Canal as a human experimentation site had been destroyed. The official narrative of corporate negligence and environmental tragedy remained intact, while the truth was literally buried deeper than before. The cleanup wasn't remediation, it was the final phase of the cover-up. As my investigation progressed, and I began reaching out to more former EPA employees, military contractors, and government officials who might have knowledge of Love Canal's hidden history, I started encountering resistance. The first warning came through a former EPA chemist named Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who had worked on early chemical analysis of Love Canal soil samples in the late 1970s. Dr. Hendricks had been scheduled to testify before Congress in 1982 about irregularities she'd discovered in the official contamination reports, but she suddenly recanted her testimony and left government service without explanation. I tracked Dr. Hendricks down to a small town in Oregon where she'd been living quietly for the past 40 years. When I first called, she hung up immediately. After several attempts, she finally agreed to talk, but only briefly. I wanted to tell the truth back then, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The chemical signatures I found didn't match what they were saying publicly. There were compounds in those soil samples that had never been used in industrial manufacturing, military compounds, research chemicals. But when I tried to include that information in my report, I was told it was classified. Dr. Hendricks told me that she'd been visited at her home by men who identified themselves as federal agents, and were told that her continued employment and her pension depended on her maintaining appropriate discretion regarding national security matters. When I asked if she would be willing to go on the record with what she knew, Dr. Hendricks became agitated. "You don't understand," she said. "They made it clear that my safety, and my family's safety, depended on staying quiet. That was 40 years ago, and I still get Christmas cards from people I've never met, just to remind me that they know where I am." Dr. Hendricks hung up, and when I tried calling back, the phone number had been disconnected. But Dr. Hendricks wasn't the only person who seemed afraid to talk. Over the course of 3 weeks, I contacted 17 former government employees who had worked on Love Canal-related projects during the 1960s, 70s and 80s. 11 of them hung up as soon as I mentioned Love Canal. 4 others listened to my questions but refused to provide any information. 2 agreed to meet with me, but then failed to show up for our scheduled appointments. The 17th contact was Dr. Robert Chen, a former Army research chemist who had worked at Fort Detrick during the 1950s and 60s. Dr. Chen, now 81 and living in Maryland, initially agreed to speak with me about his work on environmental delivery systems for behavioural modification compounds. We arranged to meet at a restaurant near his home on a Thursday afternoon. I drove down from upstate New York, excited about the prospect of finally getting direct confirmation of the military's involvement in Love Canal from someone who had been part of the programme. Dr. Chen never showed up. When I called his home that evening, his daughter answered and told me that her father had suffered a sudden heart attack and was in intensive care. I offered my condolences and asked her to let me know when he was feeling better, thinking perhaps we could reschedule for a later date. 2 days later, Dr. Chen was dead. His daughter called to inform me of his passing and mentioned that her father had seemed unusually agitated in the days before his heart attack. He'd been making phone calls to old colleagues, asking questions about projects from the old days, and had seemed worried about something he couldn't quite explain. He kept saying he should have spoken up years ago, she told me. He said there were things people deserved to know, things that had been kept secret too long. The day after Dr. Chen's funeral, I received a voice message on my phone. The caller ID showed unknown number, and the voice was electronically distorted, but the message was clear. "Miss Linwood, you're digging into things that won't help anyone. The people involved in your research are old and deserve to live out their remaining years in peace. The families who lived in Love Canal have moved on with their lives. There's nothing to be gained by reopening wounds that have finally healed. Let sleeping chemicals lie." The message was polite, but the threat was unmistakable. I saved the recording and increased my personal security measures, but I also realised that I was getting close to something that powerful people desperately wanted to keep buried. That night someone broke into my apartment. Nothing was stolen, but my computer had been accessed, and several files related to my Love Canal research had been deleted. Backup files on external drives were also missing. Fortunately, I'd been paranoid enough to keep additional copies in a safety deposit box, but the message was clear. They knew what I was working on, and they could reach me whenever they wanted. I began sleeping in different locations each night, and started communicating with sources only through encrypted channels. The investigation had become dangerous, but I was too close to the truth to stop now. The final confirmation that I was on the right track came when my blog, where I'd been posting updates about my research, was hacked, and all content was deleted. The hackers left a simple message: "Some stories are better left untold." But I disagree. Some stories are too important to leave untold, no matter how dangerous it becomes to tell them. 3 months after I began this investigation, I returned to Love Canal one last time. The area has been partially redeveloped now. The government has declared it safe for habitation, and new families have moved into homes built on land that was once America's most notorious toxic waste site. Walking through the neighbourhood on a crisp autumn morning, you'd never know what had happened here. The streets are clean, the houses are well maintained, and children play in yards where other children once developed mysterious illnesses and unexplained behavioural problems. But if you know what to look for, the signs are still there. The air still carries that faint sweet smell I'd noticed on my first visit. a chemical sweetness that seems to intensify when the wind shifts in a particular direction. Local residents, when pressed, will admit to occasional health problems that seem unusually common for such a small area. Autoimmune disorders, neurological issues, cancers that appear at unusually young ages. The elementary school was demolished during the clean-up, but its foundation remains visible in satellite photos as a darker rectangular patch in what is now supposed to be a park. Grass grows differently there, forming patterns that seem to follow the layout of the old underground monitoring systems. I spoke with several current residents, most of whom know little about the area's history beyond the official story of industrial contamination and successful clean-up. But a few of the older residents, people who lived through the crisis years of the late 1970s, shared stories that suggest the effects of whatever was buried at Love Canal continue to this day. Maria Santos, who moved to the area in 2010, described health problems that began shortly after her family settled into their new home. Chronic headaches, memory issues, and behavioural changes in her teenage son that reminded me of the symptoms described by residents from the 1970s. The doctors say it's stress, teenage hormones, normal ageing, Maria told me. But my whole family started having problems at the same time, right after we moved here. And it's not just us. A lot of families in the neighbourhood deal with similar issues. When I asked Maria if she'd ever been contacted by government health officials or researchers studying long-term effects of environmental contamination, her expression changed. "How did you know about that?" she asked. "Yes, we get visits sometimes. People with clipboards asking about our health, our children's behaviour, how we're adapting to the neighbourhood. They say it's routine follow-up for the EPA, making sure the clean-up was successful." The monitoring continues. Nearly 50 years after the initial dumping began, nearly 30 years after the supposed clean-up was completed, government agents are still collecting data on the families living in Love Canal, still studying the long-term effects of whatever was buried there, which raises the final, most disturbing question: what if the experiment never ended? What if Love Canal wasn't just a Cold War research project that got out of hand, but rather a prototype for ongoing studies in environmental population control? What if the families living there now aren't just residents of a former Superfund site, but unwitting participants in the next phase of research into how chemical exposure can be used to influence human behaviour and social dynamics? The evidence I've uncovered suggests that Love Canal was never meant to be cleaned up in the traditional sense. It was meant to be managed, controlled, turned into a long-term study site where researchers could observe the multi-generational effects of chemical exposure on human populations. The new residents don't know they're test subjects. The old residents who survived were relocated but never told the full truth about what had been done to them. And the government agencies responsible for the original experiment have spent decades perfecting their ability to monitor populations without detection. Love Canal didn't end in 1978 when President Carter declared a health emergency. It didn't end in 2004 when the EPA declared the cleanup complete. It's still happening, still continuing, still generating data for researchers who view human beings as laboratory animals in a grand experiment in social control. People think Love Canal ended in 1978, but I'm here to tell you, it never ended. The families who lived there were never victims of an industrial accident. They were targets of a government program designed to study how chemical exposure could be weaponized against civilian populations, and we're all still living in its shadow. The chemicals are still there, buried under layers of clay and concrete, but still seeping into the groundwater, still releasing gases into the air, still affecting everyone who lives, works, or visits the area. The monitoring systems are still in place, updated and modernised, but still collecting data on human responses to long-term chemical exposure. Most importantly, the mentality that created Love Canal, the willingness to sacrifice American citizens in the name of national security research, the belief that some populations are expendable in service of larger goals, that mentality is still very much alive in government agencies and research institutions across the country. Love Canal was never about corporate negligence or environmental protection failure. It was about power, the power to conduct secret experiments on unwilling subjects, the power to cover up decades of human rights violations, and the power to continue those experiments indefinitely under the guise of environmental monitoring and public health research. The story of a love canal isn't a tragedy. It's not even history. It's an ongoing crime against humanity that continues to this day, hidden beneath layers of official denial and scientific jargon, but still claiming victims, still generating data, still serving the interests of people who view American citizens as expendable resources in their quest for knowledge about behavioural control and population management. And until we acknowledge what really happened there, until we demand accountability for what was done to those families, until we recognise that Love Canal was just one site in a much larger programme of human experimentation that may still be active today, we will all remain potential victims of the same mindset that turned a working-class neighbourhood into a laboratory for studying the effects of chemical warfare on civilian populations. The truth about Love Canal isn't buried in government files or hidden in classified documents. It's still happening, all around us, every day. We just have to be brave enough to see it, and even braver to speak about it. Because the alternative, staying silent, accepting the official story, pretending that our government would never deliberately harm its own citizens, that alternative means that Love Canal will continue, that other sites will be selected, and that other families will become unknowing test subjects in experiments they never consented to participate in. The choice is ours. We can continue to believe the sanitised version of events that protects the guilty and abandons the victims, or we can demand the truth about what was done at Love Canal and what continues to be done in similar locations across the country. The families of Love Canal deserve better. The families living there now deserve better. And we all deserve a government that doesn't view us as laboratory animals in some grand experiment, in population control and social engineering. The chemicals are still there, the monitoring is still happening, the experiment continues. But now you know, and knowledge, as they say, is power. Use it wisely.